let's talk about mutations. Mutations are a change in a gene. And when a gene changes, that's going to cause different traits to appear. And thus, mutations cause variability in species. So how do we get mutations? What causes them? Well, a number of things can cause genetic mutations. Things like ultraviolet light, cosmic rays, gamma rays. Just ask the Incredible Hulk, right? Chemicals can cause mutations, and then some of them are just spontaneous. We have no idea why they happen. They just happen. And there are different types of mutations that can occur. And one type of mutation is called a chromosomal mutation, and this affects segments of chromosomes. We can see a few different types of chromosomal mutations shown here. You can have duplication, where a segment of a chromosome duplicates itself. You can have inversion, where a segment of a chromosome actually basically flips. You can have deletion, where part of a chromosome just goes away. You can have insertion, where part of a chromosome becomes inserted into another one. You can have translocation, where two chromosomes kind of swap information, right? Like this segment of this one went into that one, and this segment of that one went into that one there. And those are types of chromosomal mutations that affect these segments of our chromosomes. Now, you can also have what are called gene mutations or point mutations. And that's where a single nucleotide in the DNA gets changed in some way. And so you might have a nucleotide get substituted, right? This used to be a C, but instead a T went in there. You could have insertion, where a new nucleotide gets stuck into the sequence, or you can have one get deleted, get pulled out. And this is going to then change the DNA sequence, thus giving rise to mutations in different traits. All right, so let's go back to our concept of a species, right? Members of a population that actually or potentially interbreed in nature and produce fertile offspring. Well, the potential breeding pool is the gene pool, right? This is the sum of all the genes within a breeding population of a species. And so that's all the possible traits that could show up in the species. That's our gene pool. Well, how do new species develop through, these mutations and things like that? Well, the development of a new species is called speciation. Makes sense there, right? And there are certain circumstances that can lead to speciation occurring. And most commonly of some kind of reproductive isolation. And that prevents an exchange of genetics between two populations. So if a mutation arises in one population, it's not going to get transferred to the other population because they're somehow isolated from reproducing with each other, and over time then they can develop into two different species. So how do we achieve this reproductive isolation, and how do we get new species? We can have something called allopatric speciation. That's where groups are separated by a barrier. And in fact, this was seen with squirrels in the Grand Canyon. There's these squirrels that live there, and the Grand Canyon's not real old. It's like 5 million years old or something like that. But in any case, the Colorado River carves this big canyon, and that separated squirrels from the south side from squirrels on the north side, and now they are different species with certain different characteristics, even though if we could go back in time before the canyon was there, they were one species. But you had allopatric speciation, where a barrier separated these two groups. You can have parapatric, where a small group of individuals gets isolated. We call it the peripheral isolate. And so there's this little gene pool, and oftentimes that will lead to speciation quite quickly. We have parapatric speciation. This is where individuals are spread over a large geographic area. So just think about like North America. There are rabbits that live all over North America, but it's very unlikely that a cottontail living in Maine is going to go reproduce with a bunny that's living in Washington State, right? There's just this huge, vast land separating them. So ultimately, they're actually isolated from each other. There's sympatric speciation, where there's no physical barriers, but for whatever reason certain organisms will not interbreed. There's a bit of debate in biology whether that actually happens. And then there's, of course, artificial speciation. This is the creation of a new species by humans, right? By selective breeding of organisms. And what I put up here, this is just simply a diagram trying to summarize these types of speciation, where we have like the physical barrier, or we have this little isolated population, or things are quite spread apart. But anyway, that's just a visual way of looking at those types of speciation. All right. So one of the things that you'll often hear when we talk about the development of new species and survival of the fittest and evolution, you'll hear about adaptation. Now, adaptation is the acquisition of a favorable trait that is inheritable. So it's some sort of favorable trait that nature will select for, and so it will get passed on to offspring. And adaptive radiation is the species diversity that results as each species adapts to different environmental conditions. We actually see this in birds of Hawaii. So we had, for instance, this original species that arrived on the Hawaiian Islands. And it had offspring that had various different traits, right? And some of the traits were like a thicker, some of the offspring would have a thicker beak, and some would have a thinner one, and so they, the offspring were able to do different things in the environment, and nature ultimately selected for these different traits. And now, even though that was the original parent species, we now have a whole bunch of different bird species, as nature kind of selected these different traits to fit in different ecological niches. All right, so let's talk about types of evolution. There are two ideas for how evolution proceeds. The classic view of evolution is called phyletic gradualism. And this is a gradual shift in the gene pool in response to selective pressures. Like what we see here. Morphology means like the traits that are expressed in the organism, short, tall, dark, light, that kind of stuff. And in phyletic gradualism, this is time, as time progresses, the organisms slowly sort of change in different ways to adapt to different changes in the environment. And if we look in the fossil record and we're like, we don't see any of those, like what you call the missing links, the kind of intermediate species. If we don't see any of those, it's probably because the fossil record's incomplete. Every organism that ever lived is not preserved as a fossil. So that's kind of their classic view of evolution, this slow, steady change into different organisms. Well, there's also something called punctuated equilibrium. And punctuated equilibrium is the idea that in species, in organisms, there are long periods of stasis, meaning unchanging times, right? These long periods where nothing changes. And then there's these sudden rapid moments where a new species develops. And the lack of those fossil intermediates is because there just really weren't any. We had this sudden rapid shift, and there we go. So that's the two different views of evolution. And the funny thing is, when X-Men came out in, like, what was it, 2000, something like that, and Professor Xavier is there and he's like, mutation, it is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow and normally taking thousands and thousands of years. But every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps forward. And when I saw that in the movie theater, I was like, holy crap, he just explained both phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Okay, so this is what happens when I watch movies. But do I think evolution proceeds as either or? Like most things in nature, sometimes we probably have the slow, steady change. And I'm sure sometimes, because of some environmental factor going on, things can proceed pretty rapidly. Very few things are cut and dry, black and white, either or in life. All right, so now that we have kind of gone over how we get different species and mutations and all this kind of stuff, let's talk about the science of phylogeny. And this is when we're looking at the evolutionary history of an organism or a group of organisms. So we're trying to figure out, when did it evolve, from what did it evolve, what are its relatives, shall we say, in the evolutionary family tree. So phylogenetics is a study of the evolutionary relationships among organisms. And we can show this visually. And we can show this either by a phylogenetic tree or something called a cladogram. So let's look at each of these ways of viewing the evolutionary history. So in a phylogenetic tree, this gives the ancestral species at the bottom, and the youngest species are going to be at the top, and the longer branches represent a longer time. So what this is saying is there was a common ancestor back here, and because this is a longer branch, that's saying, all right, this branched off much more in the much more distant past, much longer ago than other things. And so that's saying, like here, these two species, they branched off from each other much more recently, right, in less time. So that's our phylogenetic tree. Now a cladogram is a little bit different. Here we have all the same organisms, and the branches are called clades, and they branch at the first appearance of a new characteristic. So this doesn't necessarily infer any amount of time, simply the appearance of a new characteristic. So new characteristic came off here, and then here, there's a new characteristic, there's a new characteristic. So in any case, both of these have usefulness in studying the relationship among different organisms and how they have evolved over time. So we're going to finish up a little bit with just some of the evidence we have of evolution. And first of all, we do have a very obvious branching organization of life. We can easily fit things into these cladograms or phylogenetic trees. And it's not just on like stuff we can see with the naked eye, like fossils. We see a similar, family tree of organisms when we look at things like the chemistry of cells and the DNA of our cells. So we see this branching nature of life all over the place. We can also look at biogeography. There's unique assemblages of organisms in different places. And so, Australia has different organisms than here because different ones evolved there than evolved in North America. But one of the neatest things is you can have unrelated animals in similar ecological niches have similar characteristics. So, for example, in North America we have a wolf. In Australia, there was a marsupial wolf called the Tasmanian wolf, or sometimes they call it the Tasmanian tiger. And they look very similar because they did the same thing in their environment. They were an important predator, and to be an important predator, you need to be able to run down your prey. You need sharp teeth to kill the prey and eat it, and so they get the similar characteristics. Same thing with like a marsupial mouse has similar characteristics to the mice we see around here because they do the same job in nature. So nature, right, natural selection, will select the same characteristics to show up, even though these have different kind of a different ultimate parent species. All right, other things we have as evidence of evolution: homologous structures. These are organs having structural and developmental similarities due to a genetic relationship. So we can see in a human, right, there's the bones that are in our arm and hand. And then in the cat, we have the same bones. In a whale, we find the same bones, and in the back, we find the same bones. That's because these are all animals, they're all mammals, and we all have that same, we come from a common ancestor, and the bones took on a different shape depending what shape they needed to be for the environment in which that organism lives. Now, lastly, we have evidence of evolution is in vestigial organs. And these are useless or reduced organs that were once fully developed in ancestral organisms. Great example is in snakes. Snakes still have hip bones, even though they don't have any legs. So those hip bones are vestigial. They serve no purpose. Whales, similarly, still have hip bones, even though they don't have legs. But here's the cool part. In whales, they're not entirely vestigial. So when I went to school, went to college, we were always taught the hip bones in whales are vestigial. They serve no purpose anymore for the whale. But recent research has shown that the hip bones are not entirely vestigial. While they don't support legs anymore, well, whales have a giant penis. And the hip bones actually support the giant whale penis during sex. So there you go. They are kind of vestigial because they don't serve their original purpose, but they still help out that whale. And that brings me to the random picture of the day. This is Håkons Hall in Bergen, Norway. That's where my family's from. This is the largest secular hall or secular building in Norway from the medieval times. It was built, I don't know, something like 1000 AD, somewhere around there. And when the king comes to visit Bergen, that's where he sits. So anyway, it's a really neat place to go.